Hi, Franz. So nice to get the chance to talk to you again, and especially about the topics we are up to. Mainly very complex and very interesting topics out of your newest book. And I'm really keen to dig a little bit deeper in some topics, but there are so many. So hopefully we will get to one or two of these topics. But your newest book is called Anatomy of Agility. And I'm really interested, before we go into the book, maybe you don't have to introduce yourself, but maybe just give us a small, brief update what you're up to at the moment.
If you look at the world of training, rehab, and things like that, it's ridiculously primitive. There's not keeping in line with developments that come from science. The science is pointing in a completely different way than practical application does. But then on the other hand, science itself doesn't make much effort to be applicable in practice, right? It's very academic, it's very splintered. What I wanted to do is join everything together and show that there are connections. And if you understand the connections, then you actually can work with it in reality, in practice. So that's what the intent was of this book.
Nice. And when comparing, or if it's okay, I would like to connect the dots to your last book, the Strength and Coordination book, an integrative approach. This is a very dense book as well, and I'm rereading it while reading the new book. But I'm really interested in if there's what was the motivation to go this way now, the thought process to.
The previous book is much more about things that are, you could call transfers, right? Why is something that I do over here not showing up over there? What could be the thought process behind it? And with the new book, I thought, okay, if I look at the previous book, then analyzing movements is not going deep enough, because you only can find these connections properly if you can analyze very deeply in how movement self-organizes and so on. So basically I took 10 pages from the previous books, the ones on, let's say, the attractors of agility, and I said, okay, now it's an exercise to show there's something behind it if you can turn into a complete book, an entire book. And that's what I did. So it's the previous one is much more on, okay, how do you get these transfers? This one is much more about how do you analyze the movement properly.
Okay. So despite your background in coming from track and field and working with a lot of rugby players, what was the main motivation to use agility as a vessel? Because there are some big ideas you could, put in any.
I didn't want to make it too easy for myself, so I think take something that looks completely chaotic, unstructured, and where it's very hard to find the underpinning organization principles. Agility as such is a very open skill situation where you have to adjust to things that are happening on the spot. And I thought it would be a good exercise for myself and for the readers to understand that behind this there's a very, very well structured approach that the body has to coping with the environment.
Yeah, because I thought when I was just reading and you told me last year about the book, I was thinking about, okay, agility, there's always some agility in some sports, but I didn't quite get the connection to I was thinking about the constraint-led approach, and it's really tough to put all these things into one area. And I'm really keen that you did that in this book. But still, as I said, there's a lot of ideas, and especially framework shifting ideas in this book. I think the strength and coaching or the strength and conditioning world isn't, I would say, quite ready for some ideas of that, especially in Germany, because they're so, I would say, just complex. And sometimes in your last book, in the end, I was thinking about, okay, how would the practical side of all this look? Because I talk about the constraint-led approach and all the big ideas of Bernstein, Neville, and Gibson, and direct perception, what you put into one book. And in the end, I'm thinking about, okay, what could we suck out of this as a beginner's guide, for example? Like a coach is just starting and being a little bit overwhelmed maybe when they didn't hear about this, the big ideas.
Yeah, well, that's the big problem, right? What you are asking now for is a weekend course brain surgery, and it's not going to happen. This is very complicated stuff. And for instance, if you look at science, right? If you look at the value of science, then the value of science for practical application only will occur if it encompasses everything. So you cannot be a specialist of variability and not be interested in let's say, things like attractors and anchor points, or result-orientated motor control and things like that, and just say, no, I'm a variability person, and think you can then say something sensible about practical application. So the whole idea is that there's a critical mass of knowledge that you need to have, right? And once you got that critical mass of knowledge, then you can start understanding stuff. And so a beginner's guide is not going to happen. Just like there will be no weekend course for brain surgery. Doesn't make any sense.
That's perfect.
Of it is so big, it's such that you really, really need to collect enough knowledge in order to be able to work with this. And once you've done that, right, eventually you'll end up with understanding basic things, and end up with a big box full of simple rules that you can apply. It's very practical and actually simpler. Eventually it will be simpler than, for instance, all the trading theory that's out there about periodization and stuff like that, you know, which is pretending to be extremely complicated.
I really appreciate the answer, because I think there's a movement in strength and conditioning coaches or trainers and therapists that they are looking for the holy grail, which needs to be complicated. And sometimes I think we have to rethink our position. And in my opinion, there's a clash between therapists and coaches, because they don't work very well together, because both of them have some, they don't know where they stand. And I think, like your answer is giving us the idea that we have a lot to learn, and we can be jack of all cards, but or is it of all trades? I mean, all rounder, because this is our job, I think, as even as a sports scientist or as a coach, that we need to focus more the interconnections. This is what you meant, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So these things together, because the body has its own agenda, right? It has its own thinking, and you cannot understand that languages by just knowing 3 or 4 words. You have to speak language, and in order that you have to, let's say, gather a lot of information and connect a lot of information about these things. For instance, take that idea about variability not being something on its own, right? Standing alone thing. You have to connect variability with stable endpoints and stable outcomes, right? And then if you understand the connection between the two, you'll start to understand that dynamic systems isn't complicated. It's in fact a very simple organization principle, right? So if you look at literature and you look at what's been written about variability, then you had variability with going all kinds of places and complex mathematics. And then gradually you see in these papers a kind of disclaimer: variability under the constraint of the movement outcome, right? Our movement outcome endpoints start to peak up. And then now common sense is that there's good variability and bad variability, where it's very simple that good variability leads to something stable as an outcome, and bad variability doesn't. And why didn't we start with that in the beginning? Right? why is variability there anyway, right? So if you look at that, it all becomes very clear and simple in the end, where they could have, let's say, if they would have started a more integrated approach, they could have come to that point much quicker.
So you would summarize your claim as it is complex, the systems are complex, but the solution doesn't have to be complex or complicated. It's getting, in the end, it's getting easier for us to maybe...
I would say, listen, if you want to understand dynamic systems, there's a very simple illustration that you have to understand. Is variability ends in an endpoint, right? In a stable endpoint. That's it. It repeats itself over and over and over again. And then obviously with that, you can start thinking about things a bit deeper, and you can branch out to all kinds of things. Like, for instance, why the hell do we need variability, right? And that's something that researchers also don't give a good answer to, right? The answer is very simple and very clear, because in a natural environment, the variability is much bigger than the body can handle. And therefore, you need variability in your body to dampen out those extreme shock waves that go to the body coming from the environment. And all the research they do is with an environment that's not variable, right? So if you understand the concept and the consequence of it, or what it wants to be, then a lot of things become very, very clear. Why differential learning? Well, because we are made to cope with a very variable environment, not with an artificial turf and so on.
You're getting 1 point ahead with the variability topic. I think when I was reading your book and digging deeper into variability and dexterity and the work of Bernstein and so on, the first step in my mind was it deletes a lot of toolbox or tools in my toolbox. Like, a lot of stuff doesn't make any sense anymore, which was in my curriculum, in the Sporn Scientific curriculum. So I think this is a big step, going away from some typical tools we use as a coach and as a therapist, I think.
Yeah, well, if you take, let's say, that 4-step approach from Bernstein, and you make it a little bit more modern with degrees of freedom and degrees constraint approach that you can add to it, then it becomes really clear that the big problem in motor control is not to find the right solution, but to get rid of all the others, right? That's what you need to learn. It doesn't make much sense to teach somebody that this is the right solution and do it. You have to, in an open skill especially, you have to have a toolbox in which you can eliminate all the other options very quickly. That's the big problem in movement control. So one of the key things then that happens in if you put it into a constraint-led approach, that's why you can put all these things together in one concept, is that if the environment is extremely complicated, the body needs to become simple, right? Otherwise you cannot cope with it. And that's actually, let's say, the basis of this. And it turns around a lot of consequences for practical application quite a bit.
So for all the listeners who aren't really into the topics, maybe is it okay for you when we are deep diving into the first topic you are tackling in your book as well, is the dexterity? Or it is a big topic, but just what do you think is important to understand? Let's call him the up-to-date coach or therapist at the moment who doesn't know what to do with dexterity. Why is it so important to talk about it?
So it's the difference between being able to do something or being able to adapt to something unexpected, right? Or something that is happening. The organization you need in your system to do something very precise in a predictable way with a predictable outcome is completely different from the qualities you need to be able to adapt, right? So if you want to teach somebody how to adapt to what's happening, then you need a complete different approach than when you want somebody to copycat exactly a solution and a process towards that solution. So those two are quite fundamentally different, right? A lot of the practical application that you see is, and with physiotherapists, with coaches, is trying to get people to that one solution, right? But then that one solution hardly ever is fitting the environment you're working in, right? Let's say you're in football and you want to make this cartwheel kick, right? And you don't pay attention to where the ball is, then there's little chance you score a goal, right? So it's all about how do you adapt that cartwheel action towards the given situation where the ball is and so on and so forth. So if you understand that this is kind of a junction where you're in that direction, you go to that execution of a perfect solution, right? That also can be a close kill, like in athletics and so on, towards, okay, we need to be able to adapt, which is a completely different control mechanism. Then you'll understand that if you take the wrong direction at the junction, that you'll never end up with people who are very adaptable. So if you're a physiotherapist and you teach somebody a perfect kind of step up, right, then he can maybe execute that step up perfectly. But then when he gets home in everyday life and he has to walk up a flight of stairs with a dog in his arms that is not happy and is struggling, and there's something loose on the steps that you have to be careful about, then that one solution will not help. You have to be able to adapt. That's something completely different. So if you then analyze your goal situation, so where you want to be good, right, everyday life or on open skill sports, then these unadaptable skills, these precise skills, will not be very functional, right? So in a constrained approach, can say, okay, it's not that you are able to cope with one constraint from the environment, one constraint with the task, you know what the body needs to do to make it work, but you have to be able to work with changing constraints. So suddenly it's different. And what do you do then, you know? So it's a completely different way of working. And especially for everything that's rehab and everyday health, but also in sports and how you maintain health in sports. That kind of understanding of that junction where you can go to the right and go to the left is, my point of view, extremely important to understand.
Yeah, that's marvelous. You already talked about said the constraint-led approach, and with all the insights, a lot of feedback I get is, okay, what to do on Monday? So the Monday morning protocol, what should I do differently? And I talk about the constraint-led and differential learning, and there's always a clash between the idea of I need specific adaptation to impose demands, and the other one is, okay, I know that there's no repetition without repetition. What to do now? Do I have to put perturbations in it? Do I need a specific repetition realm where I change some environmental stuff? How much do I go there into this direction?
Well, that comes down to the fact that things only can work practically if you integrate everything, right? So if you take differential learning, it's a very, very important approach, but it's not complete, right? If you look at what Scholon is showing himself, that if you do repetitions of the same movement over and over, you won't learn much. If you start to vary more and more until you do differential learning, you learn better and better. But if you even start varying more and more, the learning curve goes down again, right? And he has a very complicated explanation of why it goes down again. And I got a very simple one. So, and the simple one is that you go up and up and up because the variability is better. But then if you vary too much, the results and anticipation of the results, so the result-orientated motor control disappears, random movement There's no goal setting, and do I reach that goal setting or not? So if you take these two fields of differential learning and variability and whatever you want, stochastic perturbations that's behind it, and I take very simply that very alien field of motor control about result-orientated and reverse models and things like that, and you merge them together, it becomes very simple and straightforward. So that goes for anything you do in training. The body wants to be sure it's worth learning something, right? So it wants to know whether you can apply it everywhere, which says differential learning is important. But it also wants to know whether you can get results, right? That's not random movement. And therefore, you need a matrix of specificity as well. So those are two almost antagonistic, let's say, needs that are in movement or in learning, right? That make sure you don't fill your learning memory with garbage, but with things that you can use anywhere, and that are structured in such a way that the predicted outcomes will be there as well. So if you have this, let's say, antagonistic thing about, do I need to vary or do I need to be specific in this case, you have to say you have to be both, and you have to one moment be more over there, one moment to be over there, right? You have to shift all the time, right? And then you have to find a kind of sweet spot between the two clashing interests.
That's interesting.
Everybody is about between 70 and 80% being successful, right? So that's the way the body is organized. That's the way the body thinks. The body wants a memory, long-term memory of movement that is as empty as possible, as few things in there as possible. Otherwise, you cannot find back, or you keep searching forever in that big pile of options, right? So you have to cater for something that is multi-implementable. I can use this one everywhere, there, and there, right? And on the other hand, you have to have this connection between movement patterns that you can also find the outcome very quickly, the goal very quickly. So that's how I perceive the body is organized, and that's what I try to follow in my approach.
Very nice. So do you think with this insight that there could be a different threshold for, you always talk about in your whole book from the beginning to the end about individual needs, and do you think that there's a connection to training age when you have different kind of affordances for someone who has a specific skill set? So we could just, like a rule of thumb, to say there it is maybe a little bit more interesting for the body to have more variability, and when we have someone in rehab, like an ACL injury, the first 4 weeks, maybe there we need to be a little bit more low intense when it comes to variability?
That's a very, very tough question, actually, to answer, because I haven't come across a good way of solving that question. The problem is that you're actually comparing oranges and apples in a lot of cases, right? So if let's say you say young children should do more variability and older athletes should be do less variability, it's not for the same skill, right? It's complete different skills. And so the effect on one thing and the effect on the other thing could be down to complete different things than age difference. And that makes it very hard. One thing that I experienced quite a bit is that even with elite athletes at the highest level, variability is a very important thing in training. It's not that if you're getting more and more expertise that you'll only benefit from being more specific. It's not true. So if you take all this and you say, okay, you actually cannot really put your finger on it, right? Probably it is that the objective the body has for a little child to learn something doesn't differ from a high-paid professional sports expert. It's the same, because the same thing very little storage of motor patterns in the long-term memory, and a very quick way of retrieving it. So then you look at exercise. Okay, when do you say this doesn't make sense anymore? And that's, for instance, a key in the new course we made on movement analysis, is you have to be very good at understanding phase transitions. So where your organization principle suddenly flips into something that's really different, right? And I think that's the thing that coaches need to be very sensitive about. Is this the same place, same way of organizing a movement pattern than over here, or does it sound very suddenly different?
This is what I liked in your latest, the last book. You talked about complexity, and I think a lot of coaches would benefit from the idea of non-linearity and think about shifting phases and all that, because sometimes we are still thinking very in a linear way, and we are surprised then when something shifts to weight. The weight in the barbell is getting higher, but my athlete is getting not stronger and more slower, and there's always a different kind of transfer, but it just happens like that. So I think the phase shifting, but it sounds like you need to coach yourself in this skill to see this, right?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important things that let's say, aspiring as a speed coach has to be aware of, right? If you do something at a low intensity, low speed, right, it probably is not organized in the same way as high intensity, because there will be a phase transition from low intensity to high intensity. Suddenly, everything is organized completely different. And these phase transitions, you can see happening everywhere. And you have to be really aware of the problems that are there. If you take functional movement screen, right, that's all low intensity and stuff like that. The body suddenly changes to something completely different at higher intensity, which makes all these low intensity measurements completely irrelevant. Right? You can do force plate measurements till you're blue in the face at low horizontal speed, right? I think you can measure everything, but as soon as you go to a higher horizontal speed, so you're running at higher speeds, then suddenly the vertical force is not important anymore, but the tiny horizontal force is dictating everything. So in phase transition, you don't measure that in anything with a force plate in the gym. And you have to understand these phase transitions. And also, I think people like physiotherapists need to understand that much better. For instance, if you take this whole almost cult on fascias and things like that, Reed Myers and what have you, they don't make a difference between how fascias work at low intensity movement and where muscles are very active. And it's completely different, right? I try to put something in the book about these muscles bulking out and putting forces through fascias and aponeuroses and stuff like that. Right? If that proves to be right, that these lateral forces in muscles have a big influence on fascias and aponeuroses, then you need to think about fascias and aponeuroses completely different at high intensity than at low intensity. There's a phase transition. It flips into something completely different when you go from low to high. So that happens everywhere, right? In movement, you have to know when it happens. You have to know when it doesn't happen. And I think that's the big thing that you need to be aware of and understand if you want transfers from what you do over here to what's happening over there.
Nice. Wow. Yeah, I think I could say that in the name of all physiotherapists, I know that a lot of therapy approaches are mainly in the low intensity because they are seeing all the red flags or yellow flags and they don't want to push the athlete, especially when the athlete wants to go back to a sports full of perturbation and sprints, that there's a really big gap between the last day of rehab and then going onto the field again. So there's not a big transfer.
Yeah. So that's why we, and a lot of people have been testing this now with very, very good success. That's why I proposed to change this whole idea in physiotherapy, that we first have to go to postural control before we add forces to something, right? What I proposed is that we change our rehab protocols in such a way that we don't start with postural control, right? Because the body is not very interested in postures, but we add changing forces very quickly and very early in rehab, right? Because if somebody is injured, you can compare it with him losing his hearing, being deaf. And you shouldn't be to a deaf man. You should be talking loud. And big forces is talking loud because the body understands forces, doesn't understand postures. And that approach, for instance, right, looks to be much more successful with a lot of people. Obviously, then physiotherapists say this is dangerous, right? But then the trade-off that we propose is that you will start with very few degrees of freedom. So, for instance, I worked for Welsh Rugby. A lot of these boys got shoulder injuries, right? It was kind of a hobby to dislocate a shoulder for them. And then we have to start training again or rehabbing again. And what we did was not try to get control of arms and shoulder blades and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But we put the elbow against the chest, so no degrees of freedom, hardly any, that you need to control. Elastic band on the hand with a 10K plate, and start perturbating like this. So you put forces to the shoulder with very few degrees of freedom, right? That is safe. And then the only thing you add is degrees of freedom, but you're allowed in applying changing forces and inertia from the beginning. So that's an example of how that would work.
Okay, so it's a kind of an artificial way of freezing the degrees of freedom, like learning something almost new again, and you are fixing something so they can put new synergies on it.
Exactly. If you just so you have got these 6 degrees of freedom in the shoulder, right? With the shoulder that's injured, that's very difficult. But if you have straight arms and you hold something in 2 hands, then there's only very few degrees of freedom left, right? And then you can apply big forces.
Oh, interesting.
So we built that up, and for instance, with Welsh Rugby, the whole postural part of rehab has disappeared. You don't need it, and it's more successful.
Nice. Okay, so with all the knowledge, and it's just a small insight in your whole book, but coming to the idea of, okay, now we know we have dexterity, we have degrees of freedom, we have so many things to look at, but what to do with the information? We talked about the constraint-led approach and differential learning, but you have a nice example in your book. You use agility, of course, as a vessel, but what is the constraint, or what could the constraint-led approach look like in a small session, just to maybe give an image to people who have never heard of it or are not really into using it yet?
Yeah, well, so you got in a constraint-led approach, you got 3 big influences on movement, right? You got the task, you got the environment, you got the body, right? What you usually see in classic training, especially in athletics, especially in Germany, right? It's very task-orientated. Do this, try this, keep the elbow this, do this, right? And the task, so each time you give somebody a cue, you change the task, right? And then the body needs to adapt, and the environment has its own constraints. But if there's no change in the constraints of the environment, right, the body only learns to adapt to that task. But in reality, that's not what's happening. In reality, the environment is changing as well, and the body is changing as well. So in the constraint-led approaches, we use it. And that's, for instance, also different to what I think Wolfgang Schöllhorn is doing, is we don't just change the task all the time. We change the environment all the time. and we change the body all the time. And then we get this interaction between the three, right? The changing environment with task and body, and that change makes for, let's say, that constraint approach where certain areas are constrained by each of the three, that there's an overlap left where all three say this is okay. That's changing all the time as well. So you can marry up very simple, and that's what I do in the book, very simply this constrained approach with differential learning, by changing the overlap all the time, right? By changing the environment, task, and the organism. But also you can look at result-oriented learning, because at 70% of the time there needs to be an overlap possible, right? So that's the way I think you need to expand the constraint-led approach in order to make it work. You cannot stick just with exploring constraints. Yeah, you have to change the overlap all the time, and there has to be an overlap. Application, for instance, that means like what they do in Dutch baseball, for instance, right? I once went up to a batting cage, and there were these 16-year-old kids who were hitting balls. And I said, what the hell are you doing, right? You take a different bat each time. After two hits, you take another bat. Doesn't make sense. And then you grip it like this, you grip it like this, even like this. Doesn't make any sense. Baseball is like this, right? That's the grip. And then you have different stands all the time. Why are you doing this, right? And these 16-year-old kids could explain it very simple. Right? You only learn of the information that you get is different each time. So what they do is do that batting practice. They change the task by saying you have to have a grip like this and this and this. They also change the bat all the time. They change the stance all the time. The surface is standing all the time. And it goes on and on and on and on. And even to a point, they change the body. So for instance, they fatigue one arm completely before they hit, right? And then each time the body has to find with different constraints where's that overlap? How can I get into that overlap? And you need the body, teach the body how to adapt, right? Rather than to execute a skill very precise.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I think not everyone has the opportunity or possibility to change the surface, but like you said, getting tired into the task, for example, and all the psychological constraints are interesting as well, right? Like the whole motivation, and not just focusing the task only. I think this is one of our problems as a trainer, I think, because we are very task oriented.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
And when we have some time left, I would really like to talk about what you just said with changing the environment to have more information. We talked about it last year, and I'm really interested in your thoughts about it. I think Rob Gray is talking about it as well a lot of times, that the perception-action coupling, the need to put the feedback loop into consideration, is vice versa interesting as well. So you have to act to perceive, and perceive to act. And what does that mean for you, and what is the possibility for us to leverage this insight?
Well, this whole perception action cycle is extremely complex, obviously. The fact that you have to act in order to perceive has a lot to do with direct perception theory, in Gibson. So in any situation where you are, where perception plays an important role, you have to be very, very precise in what you do. You have to be looking at your training situation and see whether that is right. One of the main examples of where that goes wrong is in baseball, right, in the batting cage. So when you endlessly are hitting balls in a batting cage, and somebody tosses a ball from very close by at a low speed. And what I once did was made a video of it, of the hip of the one who's hitting. And normally in a match, you only know where the ball is coming after it's been released, right? You need to read all that information from the batsman. And then that's after you set up your hip before you go forward. And what you can see in the batting cage is they set up the hip different each time because you already know what ball is coming. So that's where the whole perception action cycle is broken, right? And in, let's say, any sport where perception plays an important role, that's the key. So in the book, at one stage, I'll say probably in the requirements for specificity in the sensory area are much more strict than in the movement area. So that's one thing that has to do with the perception action cycle. And there's another thing that it's not in the book, but I'm thinking more about more and more, is that if you build up a movement pattern, right, and that has to do with the constraint-led approach, then you build up from the building blocks to bigger units to entire movement patterns. Now, if you have a lot of task variation, right, you're probably addressing these bigger movement patterns. And if you want to address these key building blocks, changing the environment is probably much more an effective tool. So with using all the three components of that in a constraint-led approach, you probably can cater for anything from very deep building blocks of movement to, let's say, bigger movement, to total patterns, to even contextual movement. Right?
Nice.
So it's all very much linked together. The perception cycle that Ron Gray is talking about a lot, obviously is something that's on the top. That's where, and Bernstein, his 4-step approach, right, is the last step of actual actions.
Nice. So you would, I think you would agree when someone says that perception only or any kind of vision training or information optimization things are a waste of time, or do you see? Yeah,
it's highly specific. If you deviate a little bit from let's say the context in which you want to improve it, right? You replace, even if you replace a pitcher with a pitching machine or anything that's remotely like that, right? Then it becomes almost a phase transition into something irrelevant. That's the big problem. I once had a clinic, 2-day clinic with 150 volleyball coaches, right? And I was asking them about their training methodologies, this and this and this. And I said, you guys are training perception. No. I said, that's very weird because volleyball is the simplest sport there is. It's one action, it's the second action, the third one, and the fourth one. There's only 4 actions in there, right? From a motor perspective, it's extremely simple. But the hard part of volleyball is the perception. And none of them was coaching that, right? And that's the holy grail of all ball sports, that you get a grip on that. And that's infancy, but it's getting more and more clear that the specificity demands in the sensory area are much more strict than in the motor area.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. Nice.
That's why Rob Gray is so big on representative design.
Yeah. It makes sense to me till now, but this is another insight where you can just delete and throw a lot of tools out of your toolbox, which I had to learn in my sports science.
But it will always be difficult, right? I've been working with Welsh Rugby for 9 years, and in the end, I was doing all kind of exercise for agility with the guys. And until the end, I had this sense that they were doing these agility exercises, and then they would be on the field, and it looked different, right? There's something missing in all these preparation that you do that's natural on the field. And that probably has to do with the sensory information with opponents, right? That is directing much more the movement than you think. So you have to be very precise or understand what kind of components that you want to really prepare in these so let's say in these special sessions.
Sounds like you can have even the chance or the problem of a negative transfer. Then it looks different on the field, and it could be even.
That's why and that's the whole 5th chapter of the book. That's why I try to figure out what components there are in movement that are not interested in the context and the environment at all, but it has to be very good in order to make the whole thing work. So if you look at an athlete or a football player or whatever, right? If he is reacting to an opponent, there's only very few parts in his body are interested in the opponent. All the other parts in the body are not interested in they're doing their own thing. And these very few things that are interacting with the opponent are enough to react in a perfect way to what he is doing. So those are the fluctuations that are in the system, right? And then you got these other components that are not interested. They have to be as stable as possible. Those are the attractors, right? And what I try to do now is in these special situations without opponents, I just try to train or address these attractors that are not interested in the opponent anyway. And that makes then the whole system simpler, the organism simpler, as soon as there's an opponent. And there's only very few, let's say, reactions that you need to have in your body to cope with everything.
Nice. Okay, so you have almost like a list or the main points of attractors in a specific situation you can emphasize. And when you see an attractor which isn't stable, do you do something like error correction, or do you contrast something, or just put something into another task to self-organize the whole system, or how does it look?
So it's not about attractors being unstable, because then they're not attractors, right? It's being an attractor that is stable, but it's not a good attractor, right? So if I put my arm in the end position, it's very stable because all the tissue is stretched, but it's not because you cannot organize the whole system properly. So if you take such an error, right, the main characteristic of an error is that it's stable. That's probably a different thought process for many coaches, because they all think that errors are unstable. It's not true. The big problem with errors are that they're very stable, right? So what we usually do is you learn an alternative. Can you do the alternative? And then please don't do the old thing anymore. Put somebody in a stress situation, bang, it goes back to the old one.
Yeah.
So what we do is we don't teach an alternative. We just make the error unstable. We try to find situations, change the environment in such a way that if you do the error, right, which is normally stable, it becomes unstable.
Okay.
And then you flip into something else. So you better teach the system that this error is unstable in many situations, or you can destabilize it. And then it says, okay, I cannot apply this anywhere where I like. It's only in certain situations. Let's forget about it, and something new comes.
So as I imagine this, it's more like on an implicit learning area. Like I don't say this is now unstable, or I say this doesn't feel right.
If you take, for instance, this kneeling in, right?
Yeah.
Which you see a lot. It's rather difficult to get rid of it. But let's say if you let somebody jump off a box and then land in the kind of squat position, and you have kneeling in, right?
Yeah.
Let's say you let them jump off the box and land with one foot a bit higher than the other foot, right? And his upper body rotated to one side. So you keep a ball rotated to one side. Then one knee will become so unstable that you cannot cope with it. And the kneeling in will disappear, right? So you change tasks and environments in such a way that this kneeling in, which is an unstable, is in itself a stable situation in your hips, becomes unstable. And then it will search for a different position in which you are stable, right?
That makes sense.
Happen like this, like in a few attempts.
Nice.
And it's completely intrinsic.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I meant, intrinsic. So the movement system learns it without just giving information from A to B, right?
Yeah.
Nice. That's very interesting. And it's a very big framework shift, I think, for a lot of therapists and coaches.
Yes, there have been people who've been doing this now. And one very spectacular case is of a therapist in the Netherlands who is the main expert in shoulder dyskinesia. So people who cannot lift their arm up anymore. He started to apply all these things with force landscapes and with making things unstable and with goal-orientated learning. And people who've been seeing therapists for half a year are now fixed within 1 or 2 sessions. Right? It can have in certain area if you're good at it, right? Because you shouldn't send them to me because I'm not good enough in that area of shoulder dyskinesia. Send them to him. Then they have spectacular results with this different approach. So I've seen that quite a bit now from people who give me feedback after applying this for a long while.
Perfect. Very nice. So this is a very nice example for saying that the book is not just for coaches, but for therapists as well, right? Like, so they can, yeah.
There's a lot of that have changed their way of treating people completely. Yeah,
perfect. Yeah, in your last book, you started with the insight that we learned a lot from physiotherapists. Do you think now it's time that we can change the direction of learning maybe, or is it give and take? And because I think we are in a different realm now, not just being out of the bodybuilding universe and the physiotherapist universe. We have our, let's say, our own players with Bernstein being translated via Latesh, and a lot of things are coming up now, which are very nice to see, I think.
Those kind of things. No, it's. I think it's now is the time to make new anatomical atlases, right? So the ones you see behind me are very important ones from 1834, right? Atlas. What you see in those atlases, and this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, is all these fascias and aponeurosis still in there, right? And they started to cut them away. Mm-hmm. So now they're getting back, but not in a very smart way yet. You can read them, this is extremely strong. So I want an atlas that shows me how forces go through all these structures. Mm-hmm. So we have a certain understanding of an anatomy. But then if you want to know how this anatomy protects itself, right, how it's self-organized, then we need to understand anatomy better. So we need a different approach in anatomy. Because one of the interesting developments that's going on now is about muscle deformation, right? That's also been completely ignored, except in the 80s in some very good papers. But now people start to be interested in that again. If a muscle contracts, it's bulking out. The shape is changing. What does that mean, right? And that could have a massive influence on how forces are, let's say, guided through the body.
Nice.
That could be, let's say, understood like a sat-nav, like a navigation of forces to the body. You could almost make an atlas of it, right? Takes a lot of work, takes a lot of research, takes a lot of knowledge. So it won't be done overnight, but that would be possible, right? And then you say, okay, if this is a hotspot for injuries, right? Your ACL or another spot in the body. So how then is the roadmap looking for guiding forces away from that spot to another spot in the body that can handle it? That could be, I think that could be even be researched, and that could be put into an anatomical atlas that then immediately tells you how you have to train people to protect themselves.
Nice.
That's what I maybe gave the first kick to the ball to start rolling.
Yeah, that's a really interesting change with all the knowledge we had from post-mortem anatomy and something like functional anatomy, and then it was a little bit more focused on fascia. And I think the idea of having the big picture, like you said, I have a small quote, a short quote of your book. You say in the end, or it's not in the end, it's in a summary, interconnections give a better idea of reality than in-depth details. I think this should be a very big motivational quote for us to think about being the guy above all the deep rabbit holes, maybe, and being a sports scientist should be someone who can connect all the dots coming from neuroscience, from anatomy, from anywhere. I think this is a nice outlook for us.
I think it's also my own experience, right? I was, in the old days, I was a high jump coach, specialist high jump, so always in the Olympics. And then a friend of mine, German coach, said, listen, don't call yourself a specialist, because the knowledge you have in high jump should also be applicable to sprinting and should be applicable in many more areas, right? And that started me thinking in those days, okay, it's not good to be a specialist and I know everything about high jump, so I know nothing about sprinting. I started to understand that it all comes from the same source, and that if you're not being able to see something happening over here and then apply it over there as well, that you really don't understand it, right, deeply. And that has expanded. So if you take now, let's say, the deceleration profile I explain in the book, right? And you say, oh, this is happening in agility on the field. Then I say, hold on a minute. This is exactly the same thing as it looks in tennis. And you can explain why one pitcher in baseball is moving more forward with his body than the other one, because it's all the same framework, right? It's a very deep underpinning framework that you can apply everywhere. And then you can flip it around. If you want to understand that framework, you have to look at all kinds of different sports that are, let's say, completely different. And you have to find that common thing that's in there, right, in movement. Because it's all is built on a limited set of principles, right? That's the basic idea. But in order to do that, you have to be getting out of that specialized cage you're in and start thinking about all kinds of different angles and things.
Nice. I think it's a really nice summary of that the anti-reductionism time is coming to our profession, I think. So not to be the reductionist approach guy.
Yeah, and it eventually will end up in a lot of, let's say, simple new rules of how you work. I had one funny case 2 days ago when I was teaching these sports physiotherapists and master course. I was doing an introduction there. And they had to come up with exercises, and we came up with an exercise. We do this laying down, otherwise somebody starts compensating, right? And then your arm and shoulder and this and this and this. And then I commented on it and I said, what now if the golden rule for an exercise is that you need to be able to compensate and cheat, otherwise it's not a good exercise if you cannot cheat and compensate, right? Because cheating and compensate actually means self-organization, right? And to them it was maybe a bit like being struck by lightning, because that was really against what they learn in their education, that you have to avoid compensation. Where compensation might be the key to good movement, right? So that's where eventually this so-called complicated or complex approach will end up in, hopefully, in very simple rules. If you cannot achieve an exercise, not a good exercise.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. But this is, for example, a very hard baseline to shift, I think, because a lot of coaches, in my opinion, have the expertise in it.
What I see is that people who make that shift and start thinking like this, they're actually very relieved. You know, they're relieved that they can, right? It's not these recipes that they have to follow. And there's many more you can do. And
I can confirm that.
Yeah.
First, a little bit anxiety, but then it's getting better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And
I
then
think
you tell me that you sort of, we don't need you anymore. And that's
yeah.
exactly what I need. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good start. Would you recommend reading this book first, or do you think it doesn't really matter? Is it a level 1, level 2 in your thought process?
I would say follow the steps of the book. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So you might even start with a running book, which is basically addressing anatomy, right?
Mm.
This book is the second book, Strength Training and Coordination, is using that anatomy to show how the connection between coordination and transfers and things are happening, right? And then the third one is something that hopefully helps you to get a deeper understanding about the objectives the body has.
Nice. Yeah, I think it does, but I have to be honest, I will reread this one as well, because it's very dense.
Yeah, that's I know some people who have been reading it 5 times now.
Okay, then I feel better now. All right.
Yeah, so that's the way that was what it was the objective, to write something that's very dense, right? That gives you a lot of lines of thought.
Yeah,
and that's the best way to avoid people that they just can follow one line of thought.
Yeah, that's true.
Zigzag through it in all kinds of directions.
Yeah, I really like the approach, because you have so many dots you can connect to when you just read something about direct perception and you explain it and you want to elaborate about you know where to go from there. So it's a really nice summary.
Your field is pain, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't make that connection in the book, but what I experienced, I was in Australia and gave a course there, and there was a guy sitting there, an older gentleman, who was the premier expert in Australia in pain and pain management. Right? And
do you remember who was it?
It was an old man with a beard. Very
mostly. But...
Yeah, but he said, well, best thing you can do if you have back pain is do your exercises now, your own exercise. And he was using a lot of movement and how movement self-organizes to address pain. And I thought that is an interesting connection. It's not something that I would consider myself to be an expert or even interesting to listen to in that field. But I think there's enough dots in the book that somebody who is an expert in that field can say, I can use this and this and this, and maybe it can expand ideas I have about pain a little bit more in that.
Yeah, I think it's
in Australia, right?
Yeah.
This are very much into this.
Yeah, Australians are far ahead when it comes to pain science and to a lot, because they have a really nice collaboration. But I think there's a lot of potential there to connect the dots between pain science and the new insights in the movement science. Because I think even after reading your newest book, I realized that you give a lot of, even with all the other topics, you give a lot of self-efficacy to the athlete. They have to play with it. Do I need a heavy bar, another bar? I feel the phase shift. You give a lot of opportunities to your athlete or to your trainee. I think even this is a really important point when it comes to pain as well, because you have you have 2 big points on the podest, like self-efficacy and the individual. And I think pain science is coming from a different direction, but they are going into the same on the same road with the task, environment, and human or the person. So they are focusing on these 3 points as well, and they realize that it's a dynamical system and not like, okay, you have back pain, so do this, this, and this. So it's really interesting.
Yes. So if you can make, let's say, if you bring it back to constraint-led approach, if you can make the overlap shift, right? That's the best way of getting rid of that state of pain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward what's coming up next, but I think the connections will be stronger and stronger, hopefully. And to wrap it up, at first, thank you very much for your time. And of course, I highly recommend your books. Read 1 to 5 times. You can read them and still find something new. And to wrap it up, do you want to tell us where the listeners and I can find you the easiest way online, and especially the new book?
Online, I think it's now with Amazon, also Germany. Otherwise, you can go to the website of the publisher. I think it's quite available now.
Yeah, I got it from the 2010 publisher website, but I think it's on Amazon now, right?
Yeah, so it was difficult with the COVID period now to get the logistics going, but that should be rolling now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I think a good wrap up to ask, or hopefully to see you in real life soon. I don't know what will happen with all the COVID stuff, but you told me that you are working on a seminar as well, online, right?
So what we have developed, and that probably will be happening in the spring, it's a 5-module seminar that each module is 2 weeks apart. And you start with studying 4 or 5 hours of presentations. And those are, let's say, the presentations with videos and animations and everything going on about topics. Then you do a day online where you go into breakout groups and work on templates and assignments and stuff like that. You work another week on it at home. You get feedback on it. And then you go to the second module, and the third, and the fourth, and the fifth. And modules will cover both the last 2 books, so strength training and agility. So it's about these transfers, about training, it's about motor control, it's about movement analysis.
Perfect.
And it's quite a big course that you're doing.
Yeah, so sounds awesome.
Say, okay, I've been reading these books and I study them and understand them, but I need a next push into getting answers to my own questions.
Nice. So it's complementary to the books then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Nice.
So it shows a lot of practical application and so on.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time again. I really appreciate that you took the time to talk to me, especially about all these topics. I could keep going for the next 2 hours, but I think this should be it. And hopefully to see you soon in real life. Tot ziens.
I hope that's possible again. Okay, see you.
Franz, thanks again.